He's also a member of the Board of Scholars at the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions. And so we're so thankful we also have the president of the Bluegrass Institute, Jim Waters, here with us. Mr. Waters is in his 13th year in that role. It's Kentucky's first free market think tank, and he's a frequent guest on radio and TV shows around the state, as well as writing in national publications. Both of them have written widely about school choice and even its economic benefits. So we're so thankful to have him here with us. We're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Garen on his research, and then we'll move to questions after that. So let's welcome Dr. Garen.
Well, thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very nice introduction. I'm happy to be here. And as Christopher noted there, Jim and I are working hard on the Amendment 2 issues and school choice issues, and I've done a good bit of work on school choice and both the national picture as well as the local picture, and so that's what we're going to work through some of that, not only my work, but just generally issues here. Now, of course, having a healthy economy, a prosperous economy in Kentucky and elsewhere does depend on the skill set of individuals in the workforce, and that's where schooling comes in. It can be a very valuable way to lift people up, and so it's very important in that regard, as well as just having a good what people call they call it different things, sort of social skills, that is having a good attitudes, good work ethic. So I think Kentucky does well on the latter, and for some subsets of the population does well on the former, but there's a lot who don't do well. So let's start into this presentation, and so go ahead. Okay, thank you. Here's our setting that we're in now, and I guess everyone knows this. Go ahead. And that the passage of Amendment 2 in Kentucky would allow the legislature to consider funding school choice and charter school programs. And these would be alternatives to the traditional public school and could present some competition to the traditional public school. So go ahead, and so this is some of the wording. The General Assembly may provide financial support for the education of students outside the system of common schools. And what other states have done in this regard are, we'll get to that in a second. But so here's the question, the prefatory question. Why would we consider this in the Commonwealth? And what are its likely effects? So I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. And this is some background on long-term problems in K through 12. And this is the national picture in the United States. And you probably can't see these very well over here. But this picture is what has happened to inflation-adjusted per-pupil spending in the United States from 1970 all the way. This graph ends in 2019. And as you can see there, it's almost a straight line up, except for this little period right here. This is right after the Great Recession when funding tended to fall, and then it's coming back up. This picture over here is what happens to one of the this is so-called the Nation's Report Card. It's officially called the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP, as we like to call it. This is what's happened to the fourth grade reading average score from 1970 all the way through 2019. Gone up a little bit here and there, but mostly it's almost flat. And that's also true of the other scores that the NAEP, as we call it, uses the grade 4 math as well as grade 8 reading and reading and math. This is, down here is what people call productivity. This is test score points per $1,000 of investment. So this, if you take $1,000, this is what you get out of it in terms of the test score points. And of course, it's gone continuously down. Now let's do the next slide, and this is a picture in Kentucky. We don't, oops. Here we go. Now that is one of the links, somehow. In Kentucky, I've got a nice slide on Kentucky, but in Kentucky, I've got data from You see how good of a speaker I can describe my graph here. This is Kentucky on the left. Over here is funding per pupil, and this is from 1990 forward. And I have this relative to 1990. What this number is right here, 2.22, is that means 2.22 times as much as spent per pupil after inflation, and I think this is 2022, as in 1990. So he spent more than double. In fact, the number in 1990 was about $4,000 per pupil for the dollars at the time. If you adjust for inflation, that's about $8,000 in today's prices. Last year, not 24, but 23, the per pupil funding for Kentucky schools was about $20,000. So from $8,000 to $20,000, that's no inflation there, okay? And this down here shows what's happened to our 4th and 8th grade reading and math scores, the national test, the nation's report card test, relative to 1990. So almost flat, almost flat. And this is what's happened to our productivity scores per. So people who are opposed to Amendment 2 and school choice generally will say, well, we just need to properly fund our schools and that's going to solve the problem. Well, look what's happened in the last 30 years since the Kentucky Education Reform Act of 1990. We've been funding and funding and funding, and there's not much happening in test score-wise. So, other states have faced these problems, and let's see what other states have done. Of course, well, here's another one. This is recent state testing. Go ahead. There should be a graph there, though, but it isn't. Okay. Well, I'll tell you the numbers. Just as an example, in 2023, 4th grade math, 41% of Kentucky 4th graders achieved a score of proficient or better on their 4th grade math state test. I think it's 41%. No, I think it's actually, I'm pulling my memory here, 42, I think. In 2024, that improved to 43%. So that's an example of what's happening on average in Kentucky schools. Now, that said, there are some really good schools out there. And Lexington has got some quite good magnet schools, and the kids who go through there, they seem to do great. But you know, an average is kind of in the middle. So if you got a bunch of kids up here, and the average is here, that means there's a bunch of kids way down here. So it looks like the really smart kids are really well supported, live in the right neighborhoods. I think they seem to be doing well up here in Kentucky, but we've got a whole bunch of kids or not. Okay. And a lot of other states face these problems at various times. And so what have other states done? And this is, of course, various school choice programs. Well, among other things, a lot of them are trying funding, but these are the ones that are the big reforms that we're talking about. Education savings accounts, vouchers, scholarship, or ESA tax credits, and individual tax credits, or public charter schools. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. And these are becoming more common. 33 states plus the District of Columbia has some school choice programs. Let's go ahead. We've got a nice picture there for you. This is their growth over time. Most of the lines all the lines are going up. There's a couple that drop down where a state let one of these programs expire and then they renewed it. And there's substantial growth in all of these. Next one is 44 states have charter schools. In fact, a lot of people say 45, but they count Kentucky in that. And Kentucky has a charter school law, but in the 2017 law that nobody ever did anything with, and now the current, the more recent laws under Supreme Court judge. So I say 44, and here's what happened with the growth of charter schools: a big growth in the 1990s and early 2000s, and up into the 40s, and so almost all states have charter schools and have had for quite some time. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, I got a bunch of these. Okay, so here's some key features of parental choice in school competition. By the way, this is what these programs bring. It brings some choice for parents. You can apply to go to a charter school if they're there, or these other programs have funding that you can get an education savings account where there's a deposit made for you in your child's name, or in your name for your child's education to be used for tuition or tutoring and other things like that. Vouchers are usually just for tuition, and then the scholarship tax credits are a scholarship for your child. It's funded through tax credits rather than a direct appropriation. But here's a key feature of this. To attract students, to attract funding, schools must attract parents and, of course, their kids. So money follows students. And that means, for charters and private schools, parents who withdraw their kids in poorly performing charters or privates, the schools lose the revenue that comes from those kids. And the converse, for good performing schools, they draw in more parents, they draw in more revenue. And so that makes a link between the resources you get and the success you show. And that's just simply, that's a level of accountability that is simply not there for public schools. In fact, I like the accountability, I think, is kind of a polite term for incentives, right? People don't like to talk about incentives in education. We want to educate our kids because we want to do that, and of course we do. But accountability means when you do a bad job, you've got to fix it, or there's some consequence of not fixing it. If you do a good job, there's some reward for that. That's accountability. But that basically is the same as incentives. And so this kind of accountability provides a critical layer of incentives. So again, no matter how you twist and turn, the public system simply does not have this level of accountability. Okay, and the public school accountability, so-called accountability in public schools is left with kind of this mess that we're in. So people talk about, well, where's the accountability for all these private schools and charter schools and so on and so forth. And yeah, accountability obviously is very, very important. But why not ask the other question? Where is the accountability, the so-called accountability, for the public schools? There's been lots of negative outcomes. Where are the consequences? Where is the fix? Okay. It turns out public schools, of course, have a lot of their funding comes from you have to sway the right political folks, and those are political clout, and so there's a lot of incentive to do that rather than focus on getting what's right for the kids. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the effects here that people have found in the research literature. We call it literature in the academic world, but you don't read this for for entertainment. We're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to look at what students are typically served. And most school choice programs limit eligibility of those who can receive an ESA or a voucher or a scholarship. To lower-income families and children with special needs or learning disabilities. Now, recently, there's some states that expanded the income eligibility very widely. Some states have made it unlimited. But still, there's a recent analysis of Arizona expanded program. They have a so-called universal eligibility now. And the analysis of the Common Sense Institute finds, quote, Arizona's school choice programs support relatively high participation rates in private schooling by low and middle income families. So it's not simply meant a handover, a gift to high income individuals. And then regarding charter schools, here's the Department of Education finds that charter schools, as a share of their enrollment, serve more Black and Hispanic students and fewer white students. Moreover, this is my comment, many charters target low-income minority communities. In fact, the charters in New York City are specifically targeted at low-income areas. Okay, now, what happens with these students in these programs? So let's first talk about student test scores. And I sort of get the idea that there's sometimes test score mania out there, or testing mania out there. We test everything. But I do think there are some important tests. In particular, I like to think about the ones that the NAEP, the National Testing, does. It's the 4th and 8th grade reading and math. These are basic skills, right? You got to be numerate and literate. And it starts early, and if you can be numerate and literate at that grade level, at the 4th grade, that carries forward, and in high school, it especially carries forward. So there's a lot of testing in reading and math, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Although, sometimes it seems like, testing is not the only thing you want out of an education. So, school choice programs, well, there's ways in which people have evaluated school choice programs as well as a host of other kinds of programs. And I guess what's thought to be the best way is do what's called random assignment. And this is where, in this context, where there are school choice programs that have a limited amount of funds, and parents apply, not everyone gets in. There's just not enough funds to fund everyone. So what they have done for some of these programs is they random assignment. You are randomly chosen. So now you've got kind of the classic experiment where randomly selected people get this treatment, get the kids get into the school choice program, the private school, and this other randomly set group does not. Let's see what happens. Now, it turns out there's not a lot of those that have gone on. In fact, Ed Choice, there's an Ed Choice Kentucky, which is a really good organization. There's an Ed Choice, just Ed Choice, which is a national organization up in Indianapolis, and they do a lot of the research, or summarize a lot of the research. And they found 17 random assignment studies. Of those, 11 find some positive effects, 4 show no effect, and there's 2 that are kind of anomalous, both from Louisiana, that show negative effects. An example of the results here, and you guys, I'm sure, can read that from back there. This article examines the effects of school choice vouchers on student test scores in New York, Dayton, and Washington. The evaluations in all 3 cities are designed as randomized field trials. After 2 years, African Americans who switched from public to private schools gained, relative to their public school peers, an average of 6.3 national percentile ranking points in the 3 cities on the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. So the Iowa Test of Basic Skills is a test that they pulled in from somewhere else to test these kids, and they're randomly assigned, so this has got a lot of legitimacy here. So that's an example of one of the studies. Let's turn to charter schools here. And there's been quite a number of studies of charter schools, and a Stanford University Institute finds, reviewing all these studies, looking at year-to-year academic progress from 2015 to 2019, the typical charter school in our national sample has reading and math gains that outpace their peers in the traditional public school, abbreviated TPS, they otherwise would have attended. Black and Hispanic students in charter schools advance more than their TPS peers by large margins in both reading and math. So these work, typically, especially, it looks like for low-income and minority students. Now, that doesn't mean that every charter school or every public voucher program is going to work everywhere, every time. But it looks like the odds are pretty good. Jim was in a debate on Monday, and one of his opponents said, doing this is just too risky. Well, no. The odds are really, like you say, nothing's going to be 100%. The odds are going to be with you doing this relative to what we're doing now. So here's an example, and this you can probably see. This is from Success Academy Charter Schools in New York City. And the gold bars are their passing rate on the New York State. This is the language exam, English reading, and this one over on the right is the math passing rate. As you can see, compared to other charters and compared to New York City as a whole, they're blowing it out of the water. So they figured something out here. And so that's an example of the kind of successes that have occurred. Okay, next slide. Now there are other things that we'd like for kids to pick up on as they grow up and go through school, and school can help that. There's lots of sort of attitudinal kind of things that is important for kids. And there have been some studies of, EdChoice reviews these studies of other effects. And again, these are not widely done, but there's some that give a sense of what's going on there. And in fact, some of the studies looked at things like tolerance for the rights of others. Yeah, like how about free speech, right? Civic knowledge, voluntarism, civic skills, voter registration, and patriotism. And what they found from their studies is that there's only 11 of them that they found. 6 of them found a positive effect, 5 found no effect. And there's none that found a negative effect. Regarding charter schools, some find little effects, but some find some positive effects. Here's an example of one that finds a positive effect. Keep going there. Well, I don't know how I did that. The current results, this is from a North Carolina study, paints a considerably beneficial picture for students who switch to a charter school in 9th grade from the TPS, the traditional public school sector. These students are less likely to be chronically absent and suspended in the 9th grade, and are less likely to commit crimes and more likely to register and vote as an adult. In many cases, these effects are driven by students from less resourced backgrounds who would otherwise be exposed to more difficult educational environments. In other words, these are low-income kids who are especially helped by this. Okay, what else? The competitive effect of traditional public schools. Okay, this is talking about what happens to kids when they're able to move from the traditional public sector to a private school or a charter school. But what about the remaining kids in the public schools? And so there's been quite a number of studies of this, and many are consistent with the findings of some recent paper by Figlio et al. And it says, using a rich data set that merges student level records with birth records, we explore how a Florida private school choice program affected public school outcomes. We observe growing benefits, which are higher standardized test scores, lower absenteeism and suspension rates, to students attending public schools with more pre-programmed private school options as the program matured. So there's something going on when you have, Florida actually has a lot of school choice, but as their school choice has gotten more and more substantial, the public schools are responding to this and getting better. Let's go on. Now, here's the paper that Christopher was referring to. Can an entire state be lifted by competition? And this is a study I looked at, and I was a little skeptical because this was pre-pandemic, 2019 and before data, because most of the school choice programs were relatively small, and still many of them are. The eligibility is fairly limited. So can these limited programs, and charter schools as well, we're in here, can these limited programs actually affect the entire state's test score? And to do so would have to be through competitive effects. That is, pulling kids away from the public gets the message, and everyone does better. So here's what I found. This is a paper of mine. The specific issue, I addressed this, and let's go cut to the chase here. This paper finds remarkably large and robust effects, especially from voucher and ESA programs. This seems to be driven by the relatively high levels of funding for students in these programs, even if only a small number are eligible. Such programs are associated with large improvements in grade 4 reading and math, NAEP test scores, and are much bigger than the effect of school funding. So what I found with these programs, and again, these are from 1990 all the way through 2019, there were a set of programs that had very little funding associated with them, like a couple of $1,000 if you got a scholarship tax credit. And then the other programs that had more funding. We doing okay on time?
That's 2 to 5 minutes.
Okay, we can do that. And we're almost done. But now, the amount of funding we're talking about, though, is not as much as you might think. So let's look at the next slide. And this is from a recent study by Ed Choice, that this is for all of these school choice programs. What we do is we take the program, say, well, how much could kids receive in the choice program versus what they would get, well, how they would be funded in the public school. And this bar here, for all programs, this is 2022, if the child went to public school, their per pupil funding would be over $17,000. If they go into a choice program, what they would receive is a little over $6,000. So the $6,000 actually for these choice programs is a pretty good amount and enough to get that effectiveness. But still, it's way, way, way less than what the cost of public schools. I think I got 2 more slides. Here's a Florida example. Go ahead and put them both up here. You can see a blue line and an orange line. And there's a little gray line there. The gray line is the United States. The blue line is Florida. The orange line is Kentucky. This is for 4th grade. This is, by the way, from a Bluegrass Institute study by Richard Ennis. This is for white students. This is for black students. What jumps out of there is that Florida starts way down at the bottom and goes way up. And Kentucky and the U.S. don't change a heck of a lot. But what has happened in Florida is in 2000 they instituted a big bunch of school choice and kept it going. So they have really ramped things up. Okay, last slide is basically reiterating what I just said here. It's so-called consumer choice and provider competition are strong forces for any good or service. And that applies to schooling as well. And the evidence shows that this is the case. And the last, I'm going to paraphrase another economist here. I'll tell you who this is in a minute. And he has a phrase called conformity without agreement. And this is what public sector does, right? They set a policy, everyone has to conform, even if you don't like it. And obviously that's not going to work because everyone's not the same. And it can create a lot of resentment if you really don't like it. A much better way to do this is what this famous economist calls, by the way, it's Milton Friedman, agreement without conformity of markets, is that we agree we can do things differently. And that's what works best. And having school choice gives us a measure of that. We are allowed to do what we think is best. We agree to let one another do that. And in such a setting, things turn out better because not what's good for you is not necessarily good for me. But it makes for much, it would seem like it would make for a much calmer social discourse if you get to do what I want. You get to do what you want, and I get to do what I want. Okay, well, I know we're running short of time here, but I'm done, and so we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garen. We are running short on time, but I want to go to Mr. Waters first before we see if there's any questions. So based on the principles from this research, we're thinking how to apply it practically with the Amendment 2 debate. Where I live in Louisville, a lot of money has been spent opposing Amendment 2. I drive down the interstate by my house. There are massive billboards. I don't want to know how much they cost. And they say some interesting things. They say, this is just a voucher measure. That's all Amendment 2 is. They say it's going to destroy our public schools that you love. They say we're going to get all our favorite teachers fired. It's horrible. Exactly. How do we use this research, other principles, to combat those lies?
Well, just to kind of go along with what Dr. Garen, the path he was going, don't you find it interesting that those billboards are right at the border of another state that has all these options for parents? I was out in Henderson, Kentucky, the other day, and I crossed over into Evansville, Indiana, and the last thing I saw before I crossed was this billboard saying, "Vote no on the school choice amendment." And I'm crossing over into Indiana, which offers its parents so many choices, and the competition has had such a positive effect on the public education system that there are now public schools putting up billboards saying, "Come back to our school because we've improved." So I just think that that's part of it. And by the way, Jefferson County's also spent a lot of money on busing, but they can't get kids to school. They spent a lot of money on educating, but they haven't. But they have about 1 in 3 of their students who can read proficiently. And so depending on, if you look at the state test, it's a majority. If you look at the national test, the story is even bleaker. But I just find it interesting that every state surrounding Kentucky has many of these options. We have over 300,000 kids in charter schools today, right now, in the 7 states surrounding Kentucky. So this is not a new radical idea, and it does not destroy public education. But the opponents have to make it about that. See, they've had to make it about either or. Either you have public schools or you have school choice, which is a bunch of nonsense when we look around the country. It's both and look at Florida and look at other states. So I think that's really one of the most important things that we can say about it in terms of your question is this, if this was going to be destructive of public education, and if this was going to harm kids in public schools, we would have certainly seen that by now after 32 years. It was 32 years ago that the first charter school was started, ironically in Minnesota, where the Democratic presidential nominee has chosen her vice presidential nominee from. But it was there that school choice started, and since then we've seen it spread across the country. And we've got almost 4 million kids in charter schools in America, over 1 million students in non-public school choice programs, and in Florida, put all that together, there's 500,000 students today in a better school because they got a choice and because they had the help to do it. So I just think that hopefully that is helpful. So,
that is very helpful. Thank you. Any questions for our speakers?
John, thank you for your presentation today. And I know we've talked about some of these issues before. I've been doing some advocacy in my sphere of influence with the Leadership Amendment 2 and having some dialogue with people. And one of the more interesting questions I've gotten that I didn't have the data to respond to that I thought you might be able to comment on is, what is the impact, not on public schools, but on private schools, economically speaking, if Amendment 2 obviously doesn't have a voucher program attached, but let's say hypothetically a universal voucher program was passed. What impact would that have economically on private schools in terms of their pricing? Would that have an inflationary effect on the pricing of private schools for a universal voucher program?
Yeah, I guess I've heard that too. There'd be a substantial increase in the demand for private education, probably. But the private education sector, would prices go up? I don't know, it's hard to say, tuition. But I think the private sector would respond to that, and there would be expansions in offerings of existing private schools as well as new private schools popping up. I think there's probably a lot of, for example, a lot of daycares run in churches that could start a kindergarten, and then it goes to first, second, third, and so on. So I think any price increase you might see would dampen pretty quickly from more and more schools seeing that they could go with
Can I add just on that? When COVID hit, we saw lots more innovation among parents. We saw these micro schools and learning pods, and I think if we had a program that also really encouraged more innovation, more expansion of these ideas, I think we would see more of that, and that would create probably its own competitive effect there as well. But I was just so impressed last night. I was in Northern Kentucky with a group of parents who had come together. They hired their own teacher. They created their own school. What if we could get them some funding to do that? How many more parents might do something like that as well? So it may not be a private school. It might be a different kind of school. So.
We'll take one more question. There back.
Yeah, I've seen data that shows that charter schools are positive for students with an IEP, charter schools. What is the impact on students with an IEP on charters versus vouchers?
Didn't hear your question.
Special education impact?
Oh, special education.
Yeah.
I'm not real familiar with those studies, but I do think there are private schools and charter schools who are not set up to deal with special ed kids. But there are some that are specifically set up to do so. So it's not, they're not a one-size-fits-all operation. And I think though any parents who have kids who are having trouble, they need options. They need options, right? I mean, that's kind of maybe one of the worst feelings in the world, right? If you're a parent or a grandparent and your child is stuck in a schooling environment that's not working and you don't have any options. I mean, your heart has just got to really sink. And so having some options out there, not every option is going to be for every child, but having these options out there I think is really important for kids.
And by the way, you're going to hear from opponents that charter schools don't have to accept all students. You're going to hear this, but that's not true. In every one of the charter laws in America, it is a first come, first served policy, including for special needs children. And there's some really exciting things beginning to happen around the country. There is a charter school near Atlanta that I found out about called the Tapestry Charter School. And they actually have kids with IEPs, learning disabilities, in the same school, learning with kids who do not have learning disabilities. And they told about the dynamic of having those kids together and how successful this is becoming. They wanted to open one in Atlanta, but it's so successful that the school board said no, because they're afraid they're going to have too much competition, I guess, there. But I think it's really exciting to see. So you don't buy into this nonsense that charter schools can pick and choose their students. Charter schools are public schools, and they must abide by that first come, first served policy. And by the way, with special needs children, even the traditional public schools now are beginning to say to parents, we don't have what your child needs. We're going to help you find the school that they need. So that's even happening in many public schools, I found out. So don't buy into this that charter schools don't have to accept students. As Dr. Garen said in his presentation, a majority of charter school students in America today are low-income minority students. So that's just a false statement when you hear that.
Let me give our speakers the last word. Is there anything either of you all would like to say as we conclude?
Well, I guess I would just say, as you just noted here, don't believe the scaremongering, and I do think it's important. I think Jim has said this many times. The amendment does not pass any program. It just says we can think about these things now, and if the amendment fails, these are off the table, and that's a very bad situation for us to be in, I think.
Exactly. If you vote no on this, you're saying the status quo is fine. You're saying that it's okay to have a majority of our students who are not proficient in key academic areas, and we're okay with that, and we don't want to have a discussion about doing anything differently. And I think the evidence that we've seen today, and Dr. Garen, and I'm so appreciative of his work on this. Also, I would say, Mark Twain is credited with saying that when the world comes to an end, he wants to be in Kentucky because we're 20 years behind everybody else. Well, that's not usually a good thing. But the upside on this is we've already seen around the country how impactful school choice can be on public education performance, on giving parents an option. And this is not just about giving some families a better educational environment for their children. It's about forcing the public education system to do better. It's about a rising tide that lifts all boats. So this is not an either or, this is a both and. And you're going to hear opponents they think vouchers is a scary word, But if I may, one more example, the governor's been running around talking about, well, this is going to divert money away from the public schools. We have other areas of our society where we We use public dollars but we allow individuals to decide where those public dollars go. For example, with Medicare, what are two hospitals here? UK and what, St. Joseph? Is it two? So, if you have a Medicare recipient who has been going to UK hospital to treat some kind of condition they have, but then St. Joseph creates a center, let's say, that more specifically is geared toward meeting the healthcare needs of that patient, and they decide, well, hey, I'm going to go to St. Joseph now. I've been going to UK, I'm going to go to St. Joseph, or vice versa. We don't say, well, they're diverting money away from UK. We say, no, they're taking those dollars and getting them to where they can most benefit. And the reason is because those dollars don't belong to the UK hospital and they don't belong to the St. Joseph hospital. They belong to the recipient to do with it as best fits their need. The same thing with education. This needs to be about students and not the system. The money does not belong to the system. The money does not belong to the school. The money is to educate students, and if that happens at a traditional public school or a public charter school or a private school or a home school or a micro school or a learning pod, then the money has been properly used. That is what it's for. Thank you.
Thank you both. Let's thank our panelists. We're now on lunch, so you'll have a couple hours to go have lunch on your own. And if you'd like, you can come back at 1:15. Richard will be talking about his book in the main room. Thank you so much.
Yeah.